Hello once again everyone, and welcome back to our newest So What. Today we're going to be covering the Italian tradition of rapier. Now, when it comes, as I mentioned in the other So Whats, especially the difference between the Flower of Battle and the KDF, I said that national borders don't so much matter as much in regards to differentiating styles, but as time goes on, it does start to matter. Specifically in regards to the rapier tradition, as we're going to have a bit of a flame war that kind of springs up between the Spanish method and the Italian method, and even the English method. And that's what I'm going to be talking about in regards to this, as my training was in the Italian method, and that's what we go over here in the school. And I'm not necessarily purely pro-Italian. Don't continue fights that people who are long dead and actually were trying to kill each other over start. But first and foremost, one of the biggest things that we're going to talk about is regards to when a rapier actually becomes and kind of how it starts. Both of these can be called a rapier. This is the one most people tend to think of, and its hilt can come in various designs. So for example, Jarrett there has a knuckle bow as well as a more straight crossguard, versus I have a bit more of a cup hilt to it. However, this can still be equally used in the same manner. It would be considered a little bit short, but especially when it first starts to kick off, which is going to be the latter half of the 1500s, you're going to see most rapier treatises, where the weapon is referred to as rapier, look a lot more like this, or even simplistic. And this is going to hang around well into the heyday of this, before eventually evolving into a bit more of a basket hilt. In which case that's going to become now the predominant cut and thrust sword, versus this will remain a little more thrust oriented. Now, with that in mind, what defines the Italian method? Well, first it's going to be who is practicing. We don't necessarily have a grand master to harken back to, but most all of the Italian fencers tend to attribute their method or what have you back to Salvatore Fabris. Fabris was born in kind of the mid-1500s and really kind of takes off toward the latter half / the early 1600s, and writes his magnum opus, which is dedicated to the King of Denmark, even though he himself is an Italian. And that just shows really how far widespread his style was, and that continues to be reprinted well into even, I believe, the 18th century. So it's going to continue to be very popular all throughout Europe, and if you start reading into silver, you can get some funny things about that. But either way, many masters from Italy are going to directly attribute their fighting to the kind of fundamentals that Fabris laid down, and they always tend to speak of him with a great amount of respect, so we can kind of assign him that headmaster role, right, or that grand master role. Now, the various people that come after him, they will disagree with each other vehemently at times, but all of them are going to pretty much follow the same principles that we're about to go over. So first and foremost, we're going to have our general stance, right? So I'm going to go ahead and put my dominant side forward and my non-dominant side back, and we're going to turn the foot to the outside here. Jared, why don't you mimic me from the side? Now, this is going to lead to a rear-weighted stance. I'm not going to stand fully profiled. I'm going to keep my hips somewhat square, and I'm going to keep my arms relatively low. Now, when Fabris first starts off, we're going to have a much further down position that just makes your modern hamstrings scream, as well as a slightly closer together foot position. What this emphasizes, it's a bit more similar to the hinge tip from Sword and Buckler, but this puts my guard protecting my head, which is the nearest target, and when you're fencing someone like this, the guard becomes about the same size as their head. Thus, I'm really kind of putting all my eggs in one basket in regards to defending that central line. As time goes on, people will start straightening up more and more so, to the point that we get to Baroque era rapier, where people will be much more relaxed, still back-weighted, but much more upright, and then eventually it'll turn into a slightly more classical style. Now, the reason that we're standing in these funky positions is because we're emphasizing two things. Number one, fighting for the middle line, and number two, the lunge. The lunge is going to be how we're going to deliver all of our attacks, and is going to look like so. So if I attack Jarrett on the inside line, what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend. I can turn my hand into various positions that we'll go over in a moment, and I'm going to, from here, use all that energy stored in my back leg to shove my body forward, extending my thrust through, casting my arm back or down to maintain my balance, hit him, and from here I've stored all that energy in my front leg, which I will then use to push myself back at a distance before retracting my arm once more. A very mechanical process. 1, 2, 3, 4. The reason for this is that the lunge is the surest way to deliver the attack in the Italian method. The Spanish disagree, which is quite hilarious. But the nice thing about it is, because I'm back weighted I'm keeping a lot of my organs further away from Jarrett, which means that as we're fencing, right now we're very much in distance, right? Our proper distance should be about here, and then I will extend my sword before I come in because this is now creating angles. And that's really what it's all going to be about. It's about fighting for that central line and creating those angles. So let's go over some basic techniques that you will need to do. So first and foremost is going to be the idea of finding the sword. Now from here, what I'm going to do is right now, Jared and I just have our tips pointed at each other. The surest way for me to protect myself is going to be to extend my tip over his to whichever side I deem. So I found his sword toward the outside. I found his sword to the inside. Or sometimes we'll also have it referred to as I found the sword from my outside or my inside. They tend to be pretty good about this though. Now, by creating that angle, if Jared just extends his arm forward at me, he physically can't hit me because it directs it off to the side because geometry. You can't fight geometry. Now, sometimes you'll find people find the sword into a position. Other times they stay in this middle one. And let's go ahead and go over their names. They are numbered 1 through 4. They are prima, which is when you first draw the sword. That is the most natural position you'll go into. It's also great for defending your head, and we will launch some techniques out of here. Secunda, where the nails are down, and my blade is horizontal, with all of my kind of long edge and energy directed to the outside. Terza, where the edge is straight up, straight down in the middle. And then quarta, which is most natural for most people to lunge in, which will be the nails are up to the inside, and thus my long edge is projected to the inside into my core. Now, the attributes of them are relatively simplistic. Prima, very good for cutting, very good for receiving cuts because it protects you on the most natural line for them to come. Secunda is very strong in regards to fighting in the outside because now I've put all my eggs in that basket. Terza is a good guard to stay in general because it doesn't betray me to one side or the other. And then quarta, everything lines up with my inside, and like I said, is going to be the majority of the techniques you're going to be throwing are your strongest ones, right? So you can compare this to the same way we cut out of our dominant side. Quarta is our dominant thrust. Now as such, sometimes you'll find the sword into quarta, sometimes you'll find the sword in terza, just creating that angle. Either way is perfectly fine. I can also find the sword in secunda from the outside, etc. Now, this is pretty much going to universally unite all the various treatises we go over. Caprofero does believe that prima and secunda are not actually guards, neither is quarta, and treats them more as striking positions, saying terza is the only real guard. Alfieri calls Caprofero a head of iron, so everyone's going to disagree a little bit here and there. But, point being though, it is inescapable that from terza, to maximize my strength on my attack, I direct my long edge, my true edge, toward what side his sword is on, thus protecting myself the most I can. Now, this means that when I find his sword, he should be ready for an attack to come in. His most natural reaction, it can be twofold. He can either wait for me to attack and try to counterattack / parry, which of course puts him in peril because I am coming at him, or he can seek to cavazione. Now the cavazione is that little dip that Jarrett just did. It's just a small V to the inside or to the outside. What that allows you to do is to change lines very fluidly. So if Jarrett finds my sword, I change line, I lunge into secunda, I have struck, I have protected myself, I recover, I'm back. No problem. Alternatively, right, he finds my sword, I change lines to threaten this, to provoke an action that I can then exploit. And that's really what this all is about. You're not going to see a ton of, don't get me wrong, you can move very quickly in this, but it's really much more about sensing the tempo of movement and working from there. I want to get Jarrett to react on the tempo I want so that I am safest while he is not safest. And you'll see a couple different examples of this, so let's give a couple. So for example, retreat a little bit. The tempo of Jarrett coming into distance, right, is an excellent time for me to launch my attack because he is dedicated to moving forward. Alternatively, if he moves in the tempo of me finding the sword to cavazione, right, that's another good time for me to go forward on that seizure. Alternatively, he finds my sword, I feint by cavazione, getting him to attack, I now counterattack. These are just some base examples that you'll see often, and they can snowball into several other techniques. But the idea being, I want to make the right decision on the right time, and that's what's going to keep me safe. Because as George Silver puts it, people are just killing each other, right? And without a doubt, if people just adhere to the idea of attack, right, and keep that sort of mentality, this turns more into a pistol duel. than a fencing match, and both people die. Which is a pretty big problem in Italy around the time that these are, in fact the whole world where these are being used. Now, some general questions that you'll get is, of course, okay, this seems very thrust focused. Can you cut at all? Yes, you can. All of my cuts that I would deliver can be delivered in the same way that I would normally. I keep my arm extended, and I can cut with a membrito, which comes down from my right side, by a reverso, which comes down from my left. Those are both fendenti, right? Come from above. I could also, in theory, cut a sottomano membrito, or a reverso sottomano, which are cuts from below. Those are very rare to see, but they do still exist. And then you'll have the tando, which are middle. Now, these are all fine and dandy, but you're not really going to see the middle or from below very often. More often than not, it's going to be the fendenti. Now, in what situations do we use it? Well, there's a couple. For example, I feint by cavazione and he thrusts me on this line, and I use my false edge to set him aside. Because I have gotten that wide parry, me trying to turn my point over no longer makes sense, so I will simply throw a membrito to strike him in the head. Very simple, very good. Alternatively, he finds my sword. I can use the cavazione to prepare my reverso and attack him on the opposite line. At which point he has a choice. He can counter thrust me, or sometimes you will see a catch followed by a membrito of my own. Let's show that real quick. So, I find his sword, he goes to cut, I step out with a cover, and then throw a membrito of my own. Basically, if you've watched the catcher-cutter versus cover-thruster, you'll see some very obvious parallels here. But most times you're going to use a cut, it is a relatively big tempo. It is thrown at the same distance I would normally throw my lunge. However, by doing so, I am exposing an opportunity for someone to counterattack. So let's show an example of that. So for example, one of the more famous ones you'll see from Alfieri is if he rears back to cut a membrito at my head, I simply fill that tempo. My guard is keeping me safe if his blade falls, but in the actual picture, the point is going through the head. And you will see that. An example from Capoferro would be, I find the sword, he goes to attack me on this line, and I am thrusting into his armpit, keeping this protected with a small movement in. Just to name some examples. Basically, if you cut, you're asking to get thrusted. It requires a lot of courage, but it's there. Or my other option is to drop into a more passive action and countercut. Now, one of the other things that Rapier is first and foremost known for is going to be its addition of offhand weapons. My other hand is empty, and it can be used for a bunch of things. First and foremost, it can be used in its purest form. So for example, I find his sword, I go to make my lunge, I use my hand to then set his point aside even further, or he finds my sword and goes to attack me, I parry, use my hand to prevent him from going anywhere, and then can counterattack however I see fit. And this can be done in many different ways. But these parries are going to be relatively universal. They are to the outside, right, above the offhand weapon, right, usually referred to as above the dagger, below the dagger, above the sword, below the sword. And we're going to see those over and over again. So let's go ahead and grab our daggers and show what that looks like. So when it comes to using daggers, you'll see them as a very popular dueling pair. You will also see them used sometimes in self-defense, and some sources even discuss where you need to wear your dagger, etc., so it's easily drawn. But more often than not, when you start employing the dagger, your guards are going to now have a companion piece. So right now we're in terza, right? If I want to invite an attack to my inside, I'm going to kind of drift that over to the side. If I want to invite an attack to my other side, I might drop into quarta and move my dagger with it. If I want to get him to attack below the sword, I kind of open. And you'll see various specialty positions from this as well, such as here, or even putting now the left foot forward. Because I now have another pointy thing, right, which behaves very much like a sword, people will start putting left foot forward postures. Now what this allows me to do is that if Jarrett tries to attack me or anything along those lines, I can control with my lead hand, and then I have full extension or even my full pass lunge to riposte against him. Very good. Just got to watch out for him cutting or sniping against my hand, which with a little practice isn't too difficult. This same thing can be employed in regards to passing steps. So for example, if I want to strike Jarrett on the outside, I feint to get him to move over, and I can now use a passing step to go through, or alternatively, right, I feint, he parries this, we will see attacks launched with the dagger, usually from this side, because this is now driving up, and his dagger is too far away to hit me. I don't want to try and use the dagger on this side. This also leads into using the cavazione in a slightly more interesting way. Because normally, if his sword is just there, I can cavazione around his blade or around his guard, right? And it has become bigger as I get closer. So usually if I'm closer, the mezza cavazione underneath makes more sense. But with his dagger there now I have two blades to deal with. So if I start to attack and he starts to use his dagger to parry, I will now have to go around it, which can lead to him using his dagger in the above or below to counter that motion. And it can get very complicated. But this is why you train with the sword extensively before you pick up another weapon. Speaking of other weapons, let's show something a little bit different. So another very popular, well, pretty popular, especially in regards to the defense world, is going to be use of the cloak. Now, when it comes to the cloak, it's going to be wrapped around your offhand in a manner so that just enough of it drapes down. What that makes is that if Jarrett tries to cut me below, it's not going to prevent him from cutting me, but it slows his cut enough that I could probably be okay. However, if he cuts from above, you are not going to see me trying to block with it. Sure, I might protect my head, and if it's do or die, sure, but that's going to break my arm, most likely. And that's going to really suck. So instead, the cloak is going to service very much like the dagger. It'll be area denial. So right now, the only opportunity that Jarrett has to attack me is going to be above my cloak, which if he attacks, I raise my cloak, I riposte. Alternatively, I could try and invite him below my cloak, but that's in the way, so I'm going to open myself up a little bit more so that when he does attack, I can use the tail now to defend myself. In general, when it comes to most two-handed weapons, you want to get between them, right? If I can get between his weapons, he'll have to cross himself up to defend. Meanwhile, if I am focusing on defending myself, I want to get him to go to the outside of one of my areas. Now, unlike the dagger, I don't really have a lot of counter options with the cloak, unless he's really, really allergic to wool. But, otherwise, the only other kind of major thing that I get asked about the cloak, and kind of a fun one, is the idea of casting the cloak, which we have shown before. This is more of a dirty fighting tactic, but it does exist. In which case, over the course of the fight, my cloak gets a little looser in my hand, and I will cast it down onto the tip of the sword. Now you notice I got my own sword there because I'm not very good at this. But it makes his sword heavy so that I may launch my full attack. However, there are not instances of me throwing the cloak at him. While I managed to hit his head, that was mostly luck, right? Most people won't care, will step to the side, and now you've just got a sword. But that is another good point, and like I said, that's why you train extensively with the sword by itself, because you are far more likely to lose your offhand weapon than you are to lose your primary. But, all in all though, that's going to be our basic so what for Rapier. Had a lot to cover, a little bit talky, but hopefully that gives you a good idea as to the general sort of things you'll be doing. Those main sort of actions all stemming from the lunge or a passing step, but usually the passing step mimics the lunge a lot more, and or the fighting within the central line, the cavazione, finding the sword and attacking, and your basic parries and ripostes. So, otherwise though, we should go over some other techniques another time.